Okay, here we go. So just a couple of reminders for everybody. The new sound system picks up everything that you've ever said, and it projects it out to the whole world. So if we could hold any kind of questions or comments that you have until the end, that would be really, really helpful. So appreciate that. We are going to ask for the people online to please stay muted so that we don't pick up your dog's barking or your cat's meowing or somebody cutting your grass. So appreciate that as well. Snoring. I don't think there's going to be any snoring. We've got a great speaker today. So, all right. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the NAL First Thursday program. Today is August 7th, 2025. I checked. I'm Lisa Spence, and I'll be your host for today. And our speaker today is Ken Young, who has been a longtime member of the NASA Alumni League and a great storyteller. So we're in for a real treat today. So Ken sent me his bio. It was 37 pages long. And then he sent a separate file that had just the awards that he has received, awards and honors. And that was another 17 pages. So sit tight while I read through his very, very impressive bio. So Ken started his 49-year career as an aerospace engineer in June 1962. He was assigned to the Rendezvous Analysis Branch of the Mission Analysis Division at the Manned Spacecraft Center, which is now known as JSC. He was one of 6 engineers assigned to develop the entirely new space disciplines of rendezvous and orbital mechanics. During his 25-year career at NASA, he applied these disciplines to the rendezvous and orbital trajectory analyses, computer software tool development, and mission designs required for detailed Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, Apollo-Soyuz, Space Shuttle, and Space Station mission concepts, plans, and flight support operations. Okay, so he wasn't there long enough for Artemis. I think that's the only program that he wasn't there for. His expertise in these new disciplines led to the highly successful firsts, such as the world's first space rendezvous on Gemini 6A/7 in December 1965, and the first moon landing, okay, of Apollo 11 in July 1969. In the early to mid 1970s with the Apollo-Soyuz, and again in the 1980s with Space Shuttle and Space Station, he was the trajectory lead, U.S. trajectory lead for the joint flight ASTP with the Soviet Union in July 1975, which contributed to the collaborations that we currently have between our countries. Ken left the Federal Service in 1987. Apparently he heard that that was the year they hired me. And he spent the next 24 years as an expert in rendezvous flight dynamics and space systems integration as a consultant and or senior manager for several NASA and DoD contractors, including SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton, and Northrop Grumman. He finally retired in 2011. Ken received a BS degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. He also completed the management development program for NASA at the University of Houston, Clear Lake, go Hawks, in 1975. He was one of 50 NASA flight operations persons honored at the Seattle Air and Space Museum's Wings of Heroes event for the 40th Apollo 11 celebration. Here's the condensed part. He also received numerous awards and recognition during his career, and we'll hear some of it today, that some of that recognition could not be made publicly. Ken lives in El Lago, Texas, very close to JSC with his wife, Tricia. He enjoys traveling, telling NASA war stories, watching most sports except for hockey and soccer, and following the exploits and careers of their 9 grandchildren. He's also a published author. He has written stories about his space experiences, travel adventures, and his childhood memories. So today we're going to hear about some of his unique experiences from his treasure trove of stories, including some of the untold stories about STS-1.
Oh,
You're up.
I see. Got a little back trouble. The mic. Oh. Thank you, Lisa. Oh. Okay. Can you hear me? I usually speak pretty loud. First, I want to start with a couple of thank yous and then a couple of promises before I get into the meat of this enthralling story. First of all, I want to thank Lisa for inviting me to make this talk and the other NAL staff. And I also want to thank Dave Chavant here, who is some kind of, what do they call it, a savant on computers and Zoom and all these dueling computers that we had going on here to project all of this. And by the way, adding some film, I didn't have any pictures. And then he added them in for those of you who can't read yet. I know that includes a few NASA guys I worked with. But I usually speak loud enough. I took lessons from Ed Findell, if any of you remember him. And he's still around, by the way. But if I don't speak up, just say, what? And Dave will do the slides here as I call off my thing, page number. The other promise I make, promise I'll try not to go into too many tangential side stories. That's one of my huge failings, and I understand it, but I guess always being a mission planner, we consider every avenue, and when they pop up in my rehash of them, it's just because I found out something interesting on the side. But I'll try not to make too many detours in my 13-slide presentation today. And tied along with that promise is I'm not going to eat into any of the keg time. So this first title page is just talking about the concern of what everybody had basically for STS-1, one of many concerns. The biggest concern is this was the first manned vehicle ever launched as the first non-stacked, totally tested vehicle. Now, the Russians had done it with not too great success, as a matter of fact. But our methodology and engineering wisdom said, you really ought to do a couple of unmanned versions first. But on shuttle, there were several good arguments for going ahead and doing the whole caboodle in one thing. And I know I and Lynn Lunny, for instance, I knew him pretty well because he was a FIDO trainee and I was during Gemini. And we were both really worried about the solids. The SRBs were the thing that we thought would really be the problem. And it turned out on Challenger they were. But anyway, like I say, the promise is I won't go by the keg time. Okay, next slide, please. The major concern, of course, was the heat protection tiles, particularly on the bottom of the orbiter for reentry purposes to protect the integrity of the vehicle. They cost an arm and a leg in terms of budget and tedious application over years to put each tile in its place. And I guess you guys, some of you out here are tile experts. Come on in, John. I was not a tile expert. I know really nothing, but I did rely on talking to Tom Mosier's guys, particularly Dot Lee, who was one of the original NASA Langley types that really was a hidden figure. Bob Dotz, another great guy. They were the two tile people that I talked to mostly. So that was the concern, and the added concern was if there are tiles missing, how would we know? From what the crew could see, it was just the top. There was no arm. There was no possibility of EVA to go out and go underneath and look as if you could do anything anyway. So next slide. The idea was that Ed Lineberry, who was the Deputy Chief of Mission Planning and Analysis Division in the DSAD Directorate, by then we had previously been under Chris Kraft, who at this time was already up to Director of JSC. But we were in the Data Systems Directorate, not in MOD run by Abby and Cruz, Kranz and those guys. So what we had to do was get clearances, and Ed was the first one that I knew anything about. He told me in mid-1980 that I was going to be cleared, but it took quite a while to get this top secret compartmentalized clearance so we could talk to certain resources and visit those places and coordinate the plan with those agencies and the Air Force, DOD. So the solution to the plan, or at least hoped to be the solution to at least knowing how many tiles were missing and where, was to do real-time observations. So next slide there, Dave. Thank you. So we integrated, and this started with Lineberry himself in the mid-'80s, working through me as flight planning chief for our responsibility in my branch, and I had like 50 civil servants and maybe 100 and something contractors, all great people. We're responsible for the end-to-end trajectory and thus liftoff time and landing time and all of that for each mission, starting with STS-1. We had done it previously on, ASTP and some Apollo type missions, Skylab. But anyway, that was the start of building the trajectory for STS-1 such that it would accommodate certain orbital positions around its orbit, whatever those were going to be, roughly 150 nautical mile type altitude, near circular, but it didn't have to be circular, such that the spy satellites run by the NRO could try to take pictures of them. Now, everybody knew, including the Russians, this is in '81, and they had known since the mid-'70s, the Russians, everybody had known we had spy satellites on each side, and the previous ones, the way you got the photographs down were by parachuting them or re-entering them in a canister, parachuting that canister into, in our case, the Pacific, where Air Force planes would grab them on the parachute before they hit the ocean. And the Russians would do the same, similar, but over land in Siberia, so forth. Each side knew that was the way you got pictures. It took months, literally, or weeks at the very quickest, depending on the priority of. Like, that's the other thing. And of course, we at NASA were fully aware that this wasn't the prime job of the satellites to look at an orbiter flying around. There was more important stuff going on, and still is, around the world. So we had to fit in where we could, and they fit us in where they could. So timing and scheduling was pretty critical, especially from their end. So what we plan to do is use this KH-11, it's called Keyhole, KH. They also call it the Kennan. I don't know where those names derived. I think some of you probably, most of you were probably cleared for secret, but this was top secret, compartmentalized. So it had code names that if you weren't cleared for that particular program, you ain't finding out anything about it. And we couldn't, Ed and I were the only ones cleared in MPAD. Even our division chief, Ron Berry, who was off on some kind of big planning meeting for NASA for months. I think it was called the 2000 planning, here 20 years before the century turn. He wasn't cleared. Nobody else in MPAD was cleared. The only people were top JSC management. Jay Honeycutt was Abby, one of Abby's assistants. George was cleared. King George was cleared. And of course, Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz. Then in the, I may be getting ahead of myself. In the MCC, there were 2 flight controllers. Neil Hutchinson, the launch flight director, and Jay Green, the FIDO, was cleared. That was it. We had a secure line, Ed and I, in our secure room between those, we 4 people in real time. So we managed to put in test objectives for burns in different positions, both velocity changes, height and no inclination changes, but we changed the orbit such that we ended up getting some conjunctions, not physically really intercepting, of course, because the spy satellites were in sun synchronous orbits, roughly 97 degrees, a little greater than polar. And their altitudes range from whatever their real objective was for one part of the Earth. Of course, they did a 24-hour circumference kind of thing to get coverage over daylight. You could go morning, mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, or evening with these spy satellites, and they were in different appropriate orbits, all bunched around 97, 98 degrees inclination, just past polar in terms of a orbit trace, and altitudes ranging from, I'll just say 200 to, 190 nautical miles to 450, usually elliptical. That gave the plane of the orbit sun synchronicity such that it advanced 1 degree approximately, just like the Earth is around the sun, so that the lighting essentially didn't change, except for the tilt during the 4 seasons. That was the beauty of it. You could get morning pictures virtually all year around, if that's what you wanted at certain sites on Earth. Anyway, I'm going too slow. So we worked those maneuvers on STS-1, Columbia, to fit us into situations. So on about the 19th, 20th, and almost the 21st orbits of the orbiter, we had opportunities for not necessarily exactly the closest approaches. Closest we came to the perigee of the KH-11 was probably 40 to 50 nautical miles at its perigee. But distance wasn't the big problem. The problem is angular, not momentum, angular velocity, angular change as the big bus-like telescope passed going north to south, and we passed going east to west, west to east. And you got points of minimum angular velocities so that if the attitudes were correct, you could get the pictures. Okay, I'm way behind. Next slide, please. I guess we were in the second floor and flight was being flown. In fact, the first 6 flights, I believe, were flown out of the 3rd floor Mocher, which was what we had for Gemini, Apollo, and subsequent. Then they moved down to the 2nd floor after that. But we were on the 2nd floor in what became, in essence, a SSR for somebody. It was away from the stairwell, round on the other side. We had a prototype HP desktop computer. It hadn't even come out on the market yet. Ed managed to get hold of it somehow. And he had programmed in, he was an orbital mechanics genius. He had programmed in the relative motion plot calculations. Some of you might know the Classy-Wilshire equations that are used to this day in rendezvous analysis and so forth. A target and a chaser, and what the relative motion is to target, and the chaser in this case was the KH-11, and what the sun angles are. We didn't even really look at the ground track that much. And so when I use the term, well, Rev 19 had an opportunity out over the Atlantic near New York City and Philadelphia. We were going on the orbiter down across the Atlantic seaboard at 150, 60 miles. And the telescope was coming down from Greenland, well, not Greenland, a little further west than that, down through the Atlantic. And of course, at a much higher altitude, 190, 200 miles, when these opportunities occurred. And then it moved west 1 whole orbit, an hour and a half roughly later, hour and 35 minutes later, over Missouri. And then the last one was kind of iffy because of the angular motion limits, which to this day, they don't talk about how good they could do. But believe me, it was pretty impressive. You heard the stories way back then about Moscow, if you're driving a car in Moscow and there weren't many cars, you could, and that was in 75 when I was, or 73 to 5. You could get the license number off car on the Linden Prospect. I saw it, and that's true. And that's just a measure, and that's at 200 miles or thereabouts altitude with clouds, of course, generally. Okay, and we had those equations all are edited, programmed them in, and we only had that contact. Next slide, please. We got, oh, I didn't mention one story. I'm trying to, here I go on a side tale, but I visited the NRO, which we couldn't even say the initials NRO, much less write it down or any notes. We had to destroy them every time we came out of the control center, all our notes and everything. But I visited the NRO in late 80 or early 81. Can't remember. 81 was a blur to me for many reasons. I had 5 kids in high school and a 9-year-old. Hers, mine, and ours. That's a whole different story. And I couldn't, of course, tell my wife, who's Canadian, by the way. It wouldn't have mattered if she was a U.S. citizen. I couldn't tell her anything and couldn't even tell her where I was going. And I would take trips to like ostensibly headquarters, NASA. And then I went south of DC, about 15 miles down near the Potomac to Fort Belvoir, which is where the NRO had its photographic facilities, where, of course, up until the late 70s, they developed these packaged, parachuted in photos, negatives from the Air Force catching them over the Pacific. But in the late 70s, KH-10 and KH-11 could communicate to a DoD geosync satellite, which was known by the Russians was up there, but they didn't have the frequencies. And they had no idea that we NRO was getting the digital visual photographs in real time and signaling through certain secure channels down into this place on Fort Belvoir. It's called the something analytical photo analysis building. And I got to visit there a couple of times, but one time I was there, first time, in fact, they showed me the developing tanks, these huge tanks. I don't know why they were so big, but one of the stories they told me was when they first started developing photos in the early 70s, there, I believe, and all the way up into the late 70s and into the 80s, they were developing them in standard developing chemicals. Silver nitrate comes to mind as one of them. And after they were finished with these liquid chemicals, they would just send them out through a waste tank, sewer system, and they were putting them into the Potomac. Well, the EPA in about 1970 or thereabout, 79, I'm sorry, came in and said, hey, Fort Belvoir, we're citing you for polluting Potomac. And somebody up high, and I guess it was maybe the early Reagan years or Jimmy Carter years, had to go to the head of EPA and said, back off, man. We'll take care of it. Well, the way they took care of getting rid of these nitrates, they paid Kodak and DuPont Chemical big bucks, and this had to be millions, if not billions, developed a bacteria that would eat the silver nitrates, and that got rid of the pollutants. So they were no longer in violation, dumping water into the Potomac. Okay, I'm off in a side story. Okay, so we were there for the launch on April 10th, but got delayed because of a computer on board non-sync problem with the 5 onboard GPCs. We had nothing to do with that. And we didn't need to change hardly anything, a slight altitude change. Retained the same liftoff time, 7 a.m. Eastern, because that gave the great sliding sun angles on orbits 19, 20, and 21. So we're counting down to liftoff on the 12th, and everything's going great. We're 30 minutes or 40 minutes prior to 9-minute hold at T-9, I think it was 10-minute hold at T-9. And we get this encrypted message from, and Dave, if you want to, if I'm on the wrong slide, I'm still not, I can't remember what I have next. Oh, well, yeah, go back. Not quite there yet. Anyway, we get this encrypted message from the Blue Cube, which is the Air Force facility where they control the satellites, KH-11 company. And the guy decrypts it, and we look at the apogee perigee and we go, oh my God, it changed significantly, but not huge, due to some uncoupled attitude maneuvers. They had a problem with the bird itself and had to do some attitude corrections over a period of X hours. And that changed its apogee and perigee a little bit and its down track position. So we go, well, we could slip the liftoff time maybe 2 or 3 minutes and make up, and then it'd be the same as what we had planned in the pre-launch plan. But no, Ed said he'd run it, and he told me to call Neil Hutchinson, the launch flight director. And so I called Neil on the secure line, only he and Jay Green could hear. And I said, hey, Neil, we may have a little change, might have to slip the liftoff. We don't really want to do that because it raised the obvious question, why did you slip 2 minutes? That's peanuts. And so we're trying to work out that we can change something on orbit and it never be noticed. And he says, yeah, okay, he says, what did I tell the launch director at Kate, who wasn't cleared, of course. And I said, hell, I don't know, make something up. And so about a minute later, Neil goes on the whole mocher with all the positions. And he goes, hey guys, we may have a slight delay, launch delay, due to the fact that one of the 5 computers down in the RTC needs to be rebooted. One of the backup computers needs to be rebooted. And Leroy Hall, who good old Arkansas boy, he was the comm soup down there. And of course he wasn't cleared. He goes to Jay Green, he goes, hey Fido, we're not rebooting any computer. And I think it's on a different slide, but what I said was funny. And Jay Green goes in his inimitable way, you are now. And to his credit, Leroy got got the message and said, right, rebooting number 5, Fido. And then Ed at that time, and of course we were both laughing hearing that. Ed says, I run the numbers and it's okay. We keep the 7 a.m. and we just changed the altitude on a couple of maneuvers leading into the conjunctions. We changed it by about 4 miles, and that just changed the period and slowed it down in effect, like a liftoff delay would have slowed it down. So that worked out. And we went off on time. We had a lofted, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, lofted trajectory, which actually helped us do less of an increase in our orbital maneuvers. Jake Green was worried because the SRBs performed better. This is typical Marshall. Their performance was better than they ever would admit to anybody else but their own guys. The SRBs put it in a high lofted, and Jay Green was watching the abort line. He was pushing up against the abort lines, but it was good for us because it put us in a slightly higher orbit at insertion, and that meant we didn't have to change the orbital maneuvers but a few feet per second, which nobody but us and Fido could know anyway because of drag uncertainties and all that. Okay, so Crippen opened the payload bay doors and was looking down the tail to the tail, and he sees on the OMS pods tiles missing, and it was obvious. They were blackish little rectangles, and it turned out I think there were 16, mostly on the right one, but I heard much later that John Young actually found some of those tiles on the beach. I don't know if that was a true story or not after the mission. He was walking along the beach and actually found a tile or two. But they were on the upper OMS plan forms. So the question was, are there any missing on the bottom? And that was, of course, concerned everybody knew. But Ed and I and Jay Green weren't that concerned because we thought everything was going to go fine and we could get the pictures. So the next slide there, go ahead. Yeah, the maneuvers were executed on 19 and 20. And when I say maneuvers, at this point, it was attitude tests. We had put those in the flight plan as engineering, and they really were engineering tests of different modes of using RCS, reaction control systems, various thruster combos to change the attitude. And basically what we did, the attitude going into these maneuvers was essentially what we call gravity gradient, where we put the nose of the orbiter the heaviest in. Believe it or not, it's a bit heavier than the tail with the engines. So that's gravity gradient, and it goes around its orbit with the nose pointed at the Earth due to a differential of 200 feet in gravity between the top and bottom. It's called gravity gradient, and it's used. We used it on Skylab for re-entry and all that. But anyway, we did those maneuvers. The crew did those maneuvers on one of them, I think the last set on 21, which was kind of a marginal opportunity anyway. The crew was sent a certain Ops 2 thing that they had it set wrong, and ground caught it. Yeah. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned, all of you know, I think, that was around in the shuttle days, early shuttle days, there was no TDRS, CATCOM satellites. We talked to them from ground stations, just like Apollo and Gemini. And we'd have periods where you might talk only to them twice in orbit, in the orbits that went down through South America and so forth, usually sleep periods and such. But it wasn't this constant calm that we have now with space station and everything until we got the TDRSs up, and that made it pretty important every pass. And there was a lot of noise and so forth. And the images, which we didn't get the word on, did confirm that they were essentially no tiles missing from the bottom. But of course, Gene Kranz was tasked with having to put the press off about, they thought, ground observation telescopes and one on the West Coast, Anderson Peak, some observatory. And every time they tried to get a photo from the ground, it was cloudy. The whole 2 days, they got nothing, basically. Of course, Kranz tried to leave the impression that, well, actually, you know, there may be sources that you don't know about, the press doesn't know about, on the ground. He never said that, of course. He just was evasive every time the press was just continually asking, well, you know, are you ever going to get a good shot? And he did it pretty masterfully to lead them to think, well, maybe we just don't know. There are places around at the DOD and it's not cloudy. And you know, probabilities probably said, yeah, there might be a place where the clouds don't happen to be bad those 2 days. But he just left it at that. And on the next slide, I can't remember now where I am. Yeah, press was told by Gene Kranz essentially. I think, Chuck, maybe you were in one of those briefings, or somebody was, besides Gene was. And you just kind of deferred to Gene to put it back on him. Yeah.
I didn't know anyone to say anywhere. I didn't know any of this.
I know you didn't. And of course, Ed and I couldn't tell anybody, including guys working for us. And we just disappeared for several days at a time, and things got done somehow. We had some great crews. Oh, and by the way, the crews were brief. We briefed the crew, including Engel and Truly, the backup crew. And I remember John Young, after he hears us give the detailed pitch about orbits and attitudes and all that, he goes, okay, so what does the crew have to do? And we go, nothing. You're going to do these test attitude changes. Just don't, over the public loop, say something like, what the hell is that attitude? You know, why are we pointing with the sun's coming right in my payload bay door window? I mean, my payload window, or something like that. And they, of course, knew better than to question anything. They just put in the angles that were given to them. And those were in, you know, what, pitch, yaw, and roll, or no, pitch, roll, and yaw. Nobody could figure that out. I think Mary Ann Dyson, in one of her interviews, I don't know if Mary Ann's here tonight, but anyway, she said, well, the pointers, and she was a flight activities officer in the MOCR. we were suspicious about what kind of angles those were, but we knew better than to ask. We just figured them out, transformed them from inertial to, y'all. Yeah, pitch and rolling, y'all. And we knew they were strange, but they were test attitudes for the RCS and so. So they did all the maneuvers correctly, and wait a minute, crew unaware of that one. I'm not sure how you got that one.
Might have been a typo.
Yeah, they were briefed. The crew was briefed. Now I had one slide, I'm not sure, had to do with Hans Mark. And yeah, go ahead. I'm kind of lost where you were at. Oh, okay. He skipped, I guess you skipped the Hans Mark.
Might have skipped a little.
Yeah.
Minute thing.
Here's another side story, but I got time to tell it. I don't know if any of you knew Hans Mark, Dr. Hans Mark, the ultimate blowhard, in my opinion. But he was a big deal in parts of the government. And in fact, he happened to be the first chief of the NRO, but that was in the early 70s. Then he was Air Force, head of the Air Force. He was a naturalized Hungarian or some Eastern Europe American citizen, or he wouldn't have been cleared for anything, but he was. But he wasn't cleared for this program. He was aware of all the clearance levels and such. But anyway, he got named, fortunately or unfortunately, by the administrator, who I think was Fletcher at the time. This all a blur back in the early 80s days to me. 2 weeks prior to the mission. And he calls up Chris Kraft, who was his. Chris didn't think much of it, maybe if you put it that way. And for good reason. Hans Mark had been head of Ames, and they were continually in battles with headquarters about budgets and work scope, because Ames was trying to take over or edge into manned spacecraft stuff at Ames on the West Coast. And other maybe personal reasons, they were not what you'd call friends, but Hans had been named Associate Administrator for Manned Space Flights. So he was actually on the books, he was Chris Kraft's boss. So he called Kraft two weeks before the launch and says, I'd sure like to have a seat in the control center to watch this thing. And Chris, of course, had to invite him, and he was there. Of course, I was on another floor. I never saw him till maybe after the mission at one point in some press conference or something. I don't think he ever showed up in the press conference. Anyway, he comes in, and after Crip had seen the missing tiles and everybody got concerned, he's got a seat right there in the control center. So during shift change or somewhere, he goes down to talk to Dick Truly, who's sitting behind Capcom, who I think was Dan Branden's team, the Capcom for launch anyway. And he pulls Dick away from and stands over by the door and goes, Dick, I was head of some stuff way back, and I know we have resources that would be good to maybe employ to see in real time what the whole tile situation is like. And Dick knows that because Dick had been one of the MOL astronauts back in the late 60, early 70 timeframe before the manned orbiting lab Air Force mission got canceled, and he and others came over like Crippen to be an astronaut for us. Anyway, Dick goes, well, yeah, it's not a bad idea, but he knows Hans isn't clear, so he can't talk to him in any detail about it. He said, oh, yeah, maybe you should look into that. So Hans goes up to the red phone general up on the back row. You've all seen it, where this know nothing general sits, just to be the liaison for Air Force, and who is not cleared either. And he goes, apparently, and I found this out years later, hey, call out to the Blue Cube, and we need to talk to them about possibly getting some resources done. So the general thinks that's a good idea, and he calls out, and apparently on the other end, they know they're both not cleared. So somebody just kind of says, we'll look into it, and apparently years later, when the guy wrote the book that I'm going to show you, interviewed by email Hans Mark about this whole thing, Hans took credit for thinking of it in real time. He did. The whole first edition of this book is not, it's not right. It's called Into the Black by Roland White. He's a Brit, aviation writer. Great guy. I was interviewed by him in the mid 2000s, 15s for this book. And it's the best overall story of the whole shuttle, from Faget's balsa wood model that he built in 69 or 70 and so forth, all the way up through Challenger, I think. And it has stories, but the first edition, which is the hardback, is Hans's story. And so when I saw it, and I had already been interviewed by White, and he told me, well, that's not what Hans told me. I said, well, he didn't have anything to do with it. And I gave him as much as I could the right story. Anyway, that appears now in edition 2. It's the paperback edition of Into the Black by Roland White. And that's one of the best things. Flip on over, I think, to the, oh, yeah, we did this, by the way, on STS-2, and no problems, no missing tiles. And then Ed left it to me, but the resources there, go back.
Resources?
Yeah, the last, yeah, there it is. On the 16 Sunset podcast, it's episode 8 by another Brit named Kevin Fong, and it's pretty good. I think others are interviewed. They weren't cleared, but they had suspicions about what we were doing, like Marianne did. Anyway, those are the 2 best things. My only reward, and this came in a brown paper bag to my secretary in like 82 or 3, and she brings it to my office, and I'm not a coffee drinker, never was, and it's a coffee cup with the NRO insignia. Of course, it doesn't say NRO on it. They put this out in September of 81, and I got it in maybe 82 sometime. And that's it. That's what I got.
Hold it down a little.
Oh, sorry. For all these, for all the,
Hold it still
yeah.
in front of your shirt. Move it around.
Okay.
Move it around a little.
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah, it's just a coffee cup, and people would come into my office, branch office, and for a meeting, and they'd see it sitting there on the desk, and they'd go, who left that? And I said, I don't know. Somebody, we had a meeting and somebody just left it.
And it disappeared off the screen.
No, well, see, there's no, you have to know that's the NRO symbol. For 10 years, they were in business that long. Anyway, I have one other story about STS-3 where Ed Lineberry went off on another assignment off-site. He said it had to do with Mars planning, but I highly suspect it was something I wasn't cleared for. And he left STS-3 to me to do. I think I have a few more minutes here. All by myself, I had set up STS-3 trajectory. It had a 24-hour period, probably in about those same number of orbits, 20, 19, 20, 21, second day of the mission. And I had set it up as a DTO for the Air Force C-band radar trackers, which was classified, but it wasn't secret. They wanted to know, and we wanted to know, how well just C-band tracking, no S-band, could track an orbiter, just quiescent orbiter, moving along and doing a couple attitude maneuvers for a 24-hour period to get down track accuracy predictions. Because the drag is noticeable at 150 nautical miles, which was the standard normal orbital altitude. And underneath that cover of a DTO, I had put in the conjunctions for doing the same stuff we did for 1 and 2 by myself, because Ed was gone. And it was middle of December, and the operational trajectory out of our division had just come out as the final sim data and everything for STS-3 going into March launch in 82. And I don't know if it was on December 15th, but mid-December, I get this encrypted message, which I had to go to security to get decrypted. And it was basically not only a change, they were changing the telescope, the spy satellite, from KH-11 to KH-10. And that changed everything because it was in a different orbit. I mean, there's sun synchronous and different apergy and perigee, but because of its objective, I can't remember now whether it was an afternoon or noontime type of orbit, synchronous, sun synchronous orbit, but it was changed completely from the previous one I used, KH-11 again. So here we were in mid-December, and we put out the operational trajectory, and Claude Graves, some of you may have known him, he was a great re-entry guy for Apollo and Gemini and everything. But he was the ultimate micromanager. He had been named deputy chief of MPAD. And here I was still just a branch chief. And so he and Morris Jenkins, who was English guy who never made waves, great guy for Apollo and lunar expert, but he wasn't that familiar with other stuff. But he was the mission manager, product manager for STS-3. So we put out the operational, first the conceptual mission in like summer of '81. And then the preliminary mission for 3 and different test objectives and so forth than 1 and 2. And then the operational trajectory went to the simulator, the trainers, PAO, everybody. It was the whole end-to-end mission in various packages of data. And I had to change it all. And when Claude and Morris heard that I was making changes, significant changes, and I told them initially, well, they stormed down to my office. And I said, yeah, that DTO on C-band coverage, that change, there's changes in it, and that's going to change the whole trajectory, including the launch and the entry and everything. And they go, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. And they gave me hell for about 4 days, and I couldn't take it anymore. Ed had given me one phone number to call him, and it was some area code I never even knew of. And I go, Claude, just call Ed at this number, and he'll explain that I have to make this change. I don't know to this day what he told Claude, and Ed wasn't what you call a forceful communicator, but somehow he got the point across to Claude and Morris. Morris wouldn't make waves. He would go along with it anyway, but they backed off, and I had to call in all of these people and cancel their Christmas holidays to make that change and put out a whole new operational trajectory in early January. And I did it. We did it. Everybody grumbled like hell. I had a bunch of people mad at me for weeks or months. I couldn't tell them anything. It had to be redone. And so needless to say, '81 was a pretty stressful year for me. I don't know how I'd have made it if it wasn't having a great wife and great kids, even though they were in high school, most of them. They were good kids and didn't, except for driving them to gymnastics and everything, track and everything. We made it through '81, but that was one of the most stressful years. And I was thinking as I drove in this afternoon, it didn't seem that stressful really, except that STS-3 flare up at the time. And then I go, but I was half the age I am now. And I go, I guess that's age has a lot to do with it. It didn't seem that bad, but now I don't know how I would possibly go through that. But anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. If anybody has questions, way back there.
Hey, Ken, when you were talking about the tile loss program and everything, Gene Grant from the DF4 with Chief Jeff Meister and Dale Moore, and wanted to create a tile loss program. And so he had us looking at going down the tape and getting photos of everything underneath the payload bay, liners, and the eclipse and everything. And then we incorporated it with some of the simulations we were going, where he would have some tiles missing, and we call it Tiger T, and then you see if we needed to do anything. And at the same time, as you recall, we had the killer bees were coming in from Mexico. So
yeah, I remember that.
So we had this infamous killer tile that was black and yellow that we were trying to find. But for STS-1, in fact, they found tiles on the beach, and within hours after the launch, they called us in to see if those particular tiles, and each tile, as you know, has a serial number, so we know the exact XY location.
Right.
And we based on the tiles that we saw, we're all clear to go. the Tiger team, the tile loss team, we looked at every flight race for the first 20 launches.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I wasn't very privy to that, except hearing that John had found some himself.
Let me kind of paraphrase. Yeah, so for those of you online, you probably could not hear the comment in the room, but it came from, and I'm sorry, I don't know the gentleman who was talking about it, but was talking about the tile lost tiger team. And sure enough, tiles were found on the beach, and they had to verify the serial numbers to make sure that they were still good to go. So did I get that close enough for government work?
I think there were 38 tiles missing on STS-3, but really nothing. Oh, by the way, after 3, management has privilege. I had an assistant branch chief, Harold Beck, who was one of the original space task group guys from Langley in 1958, worked Mercury and all the missions up to space station. He was my assistant branch chief, so I dropped this all on him for STS-4. And I don't know what happened on 4, 5, and 6. And when I asked him today, he's still alive at 92 and a half. And he says, I don't remember any of it. And he took over for me. And so I was debriefed a couple of years later. I worked on other secret missions, but not this particular question.
I just wondered if you, Victor Vaughn, he was my.
Oh, Vic Vaughn, yeah. Oh, yeah.
He taught graduate level courses all over again. He talked about the trajectory development. So he had a lot of stories.
Yeah, Vic, oh, yeah, he's a great guy. Empath. Larry Smith was an empath.
It couldn't be much about a broken tile.
Right.
Why did you go to all that trouble?
There were entry attitudes you could try.
Let me repeat the question. So the question in the room was, if you couldn't do anything about a broken tile, why did we go through all the trouble to try to see whether they were missing or not?
Yeah, and
We did that because we needed to know if it didn't come in safely and it's destroyed.
yeah, what happened?
What
So-
did it? We
so-
needed to know.
So could you repeat the answer for people?
Going in.
Okay.
Just repeat the answer for people.
Yeah,
Just the brand trajectory.
for you on the Zoom, the answer Chuck Lewis has given is that we still wanted to know. It's kind of sad, but luckily it didn't happen. We wanted to know what happened at entry if they didn't make it back. As a matter of fact, on one, there was one tile partly damaged on one of the landing wheel well covers. And John, when he got under that out at Edwards, looks up there and goes, my God, if I'd have known that was missing, I would have ejected. Tripp and I would have ejected and parachuted down and crashed that baby in the desert. That's how critical he thought that was, but it didn't actually harm anything. That was the only tile missing on the bottom. And I don't know if that was true of all the rest of the flights or not. Yes, sir, way back there. I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Can you come up?
No, we can't get somebody to repeat the
We don't have a mic for that. Can you come up?
Wait, no, he can't.
Oh, maybe this works.
I'm gonna try this.
those on Zoom, we're trying to take a mic back to the last guy in the room.
Very much. I was missing this.
Maybe Dave could interpret for you. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand.
I think it's Mark Craig.
Mark? Yeah.
STS-1 materials coming off the external paint.
Oh, that was not of concern at the time that I knew about. Oh, there was stuff that did come off, is some kind of white stuff that Crip and John mentioned during the launch phase. Some kind of paint, I think, off the, the first X number were painted ETs, and that paint actually peeled off and splattered on the orbiter windows, but it didn't do any damage that I know of. I'm sorry, Mark, I can't understand. I'm sorry, I don't know what the question is or statement.
Dave, can you repeat what you said?
Maybe they can get together after.
Yeah. I'll come back there afterward. Yeah, paint came off of the external tank.
Inside.
I don't know. It wasn't a big problem. It wasn't like the foam coming off. It was paint, as I understand the early orbiter ETs.
Mark Craig says it was foam.
On STS-1.
Was there foam missing? I don't know. Nobody ever mentioned it to me.
It says we never got the tank back, so we never really knew.
Okay. Nice.
All right. Any other questions in the room? Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
you mentioned something about John Young being off his shelf of the spot on the bottom. Was that in the same area that Luke Gibson had that piece missing on his flight?
No.
Oh, no.
So, can you repeat?
The tile we had off with the right wing. When it started with the flight. Unfortunately, we had a double piece of metal.
And I'm wondering.
Yeah, well, Jerry would know a lot better than I do on that stuff.
I had a personal interest.
Did-
Okay.
Anybody else?
Questions in the room? I know, bringing back a lot of memories. Huh?
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening, and I can carry on across the street.
Okay.
Was the
so-
technology available for Columbia? Available for the Columbia accident flight? Was the question
Oh.
online was the
Oh, no.
technology available for Columbia?
Nobody was
Columbia
even cleared to talk to NRO on Columbia, which is, I was out of NASA at the time.
Okay, so
Another whole story.
so the question from the chat was whether or not that those technologies were available during the Columbia mission, and the answer for those of you online who probably weren't able to hear it was that not really. Good paraphrase.
Nobody was cleared.
Yeah, nobody was cleared Right, right.
To ask for.
Right. So by the time we got to that point, nobody at NASA was cleared to be able to request those kinds of resources from NRO. Okay. All right. I think that's going to be a wrap. So thank you very much to Ken. That was probably one of the more fun storytelling sessions that we've had in a very long time. So really appreciate everybody in the room. For those of you online, the room is packed. There was standing room only, believe it or not. So, and thank you for everybody online for joining us today. Do want to let you know we did record this. So a video should be available in a couple of days. So if you want to recap everything, the video will be available. Our next first Thursday is going to be on September 4th. That's the same week as Labor Day. So we do have a speaker lined up for that. So I hope you'll be able to join us on September 4th. We do plan to be back here in the Lone Star Room. And I'll get a notification out a week or so in advance. So, so for today, Ken has told us several times that he's looking forward to seeing everybody right across the street at the Bluebonnet Pavilion, where the Keg of the Quarter, used to be month, Keg of the Quarter is going to be held. So feel free to head on over to the Bluebonnet Pavilion and grab something chilly to drink on a hot day. Thank you.